Iran is on the cusp of a nuclear breakout, and even eminent experts don't seem to understand the issue. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to discuss in depth a critical and grave threat to Israel's immediate security, one that is going to draw in all of us in a conflagration with Iran in the Middle East. The other day, Iran announced that in response to a cyber attack, purportedly from Israel, that Iran was going to start enriching uranium to 60% HEU. Now, people are commonly reporting, even eminent specialists, that look, this isn't such a big deal because to produce a nuclear weapon, you want 90% highly enriched uranium, not 60%, and thus we still have some lead time. This is totally false. And so in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, I'm going to outline a presentation that's going to cover these topics. Number one, the science of producing a nuclear weapon and why Iran is absolutely on the brink right now. Two, the history of mistakes and failures and policy errors that has led us to this point. Three, the strategic implications of what an Iranian nuclear weapon would mean and why Israel absolutely cannot live with it. And four, the broader global strategic implications and consequences if we fail to act. As has been reported, there was a tweet that went up from a very prominent professor, former CIA official, leader of a famous think tank. I won't name him. I actually quite like the guy, and it's not about him. But he's the sort of person that people would listen to in the US administration as to what to do with Iran. And he put a tweet, which I'll put up here. It says, look, 60% is not 90%. It's on the way, but there's still a kind of a gap between them. And that is wrong. That's absolutely wrong. Here's how nuclear weapons work. You have either uranium-235, which is a fissile material, or plutonium-239, and you put that into your nuclear device and you create a bomb, in short, right? There are two pathways. Now, the uranium pathway involves taking uranium ore out of the ground, removing the stuff from your ore that you don't want because it prevents you from being able to create a nuclear device. And then the stuff left over is their fissile uranium-235. How does this work? Well, if you dig up uranium ore, 99.3% will be impurities, mostly uranium-238. The 0.7% left over is the fissile material you need for a bomb. Okay, so what you want to do is separate that all out so that what you have left over is 90% plus pure uranium-235. How do you do this? Well, you put it through a chemical process to create a gas, uranium fluoride. You then put that gas through thousands of centrifuges that spin really fast, and that they're slightly heavier. Uranium-238 will gradually drift to one side, and the slightly lighter material, uranium-235, will drift the other way. And then what you do is you collect that material, turn it back into a solid, and that's your enriched uranium. So why is 60% a catastrophe? It's because it's not like driving a car. If you're driving a car at 60 miles per hour, then you're 66% of the way to 90 miles per hour, right? You're increasing your velocity. Whereas here, you're taking material away, and the maths works out that if you're at 60% HEU, you're 99% of the way to a bomb. How does that work? Okay, so imagine you've got 100 kilograms of uranium. Of that uranium, 0.7% or 700 grams is the stuff that you need. As you take away the material that you don't want, the proportion of the material that you have left that is highly enriched increases. So you're not adding anything. What you're doing is you're taking away. So you've got your 100 kilograms, and let's even the numbers. Let's say 1% of it is HEU, right, to make it simple. You have 100 kilograms, of it 1%, 1 kilogram is HEU. You remove 50% of that. So you remove 50 kilograms of the stuff you don't want. The 50 kilograms you've got left over still has 1 kilogram of HEU. So you've gone from 1% to 2%, okay? If you're looking at 90%, that might sound like it's a long way away, but you're actually 50% of the way there. You've removed 50% of the material. To get to 60% HEU, what you've done is you've removed roughly 98 to 99 kilograms of the stuff you don't want. So all you've got left over is this little bit, most of which is HEU. So to go from 60% to 90%, you're not removing 30 kilograms of material, you're removing a few hundred grams. You're almost there. So when Iran says that they're producing 60% HEU, which they've now announced that they're producing 9 grams a day, that is basically a nuclear weapons capability. We are at that cusp right now. And the fact that eminent people don't understand this is a grave threat to Israel's security. How did we get here? This is a massive crisis. Well, this all begins in 2003. George W. Bush goes into Iraq and claims the axis of evil with Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. And Iran and Iraq have had a long and bloody history. They've had a terrible stalemate war in the 1980s, with devastation on both sides. And yet in 2 weeks, the American military crushes Iraq, takes Baghdad, and overthrows Saddam Hussein. That showed just how effective the US might is in overthrowing governments, right? So Iran was terrified. They saw what with Gaddafi, he was giving up his nuclear program, and he's saying, look, Gaddafi was being reintroduced into the international system. The Arab Spring had not yet happened. And so Iran's like, okay, the US is going to attack us. We need to do something about it. And at first they went to the US and offered a grand bargain. They're like, look, we will give up any nuclear programs that we have. We will help stabilize Iraq because it's a Shia majority country. They would work together with the Americans to help American goals in that region. They would, peaceably integrate themselves into the Middle East. They even opened the door to recognizing Israel. And they said, but we want a security guarantee in return. We don't want to be attacked. And the Americans, who were flush from victory in Afghanistan, flush with victory in Iraq, still on the war path against terror for what had happened in 9/11, were like, no, take a number, you're next, okay? So at that stage, Iran had a nascent nuclear program. They had a single 10 centrifuge cascade for research purposes. Basically nothing at all. They had none of the accompanying manufacturing, the implosion chambers, any of those other things you would make for a nuclear weapons program. It was basic stuff. And yet, as the war in Iraq dragged on and went from flush success to bloody quagmire with insurgencies, thousands of American deaths, completely decimated country, blame within the United States towards the government, George Bush's credibility tanking, the Iranians continued to build their nuclear program and were like, you know what, we're getting away with this. Let's expand. So they started to really build up their nuclear program with the idea that the Americans were too bogged down domestically to contemplate another war with Iran. And that was critically backed by the failure of the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, al-Baradei, an Egyptian, who, out of fear of expanding American hostilities in the Middle East, refused to find non-compliance in Iran, even though Iran was blatantly violating the NPT in all kinds of ways, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, those responsible for finding non-compliance refused to do so. El-Baradei never contemplated that that wasn't actually his job, but he decided to become a political figure in order to make it more difficult for the international community to act. Fast forward then to Barack Obama's administration, and he wants to offer Iran a nuclear deal. And the deal would limit, not eliminate, limit Iran's cascades, enrichment capabilities, fissile material program for a period of sort of 8 to 10 years. Now, to demonstrate how far Iran had come in that time, the deal was to limit Iran's centrifuge cascade to something like 21,000 or 14,000, some huge number relative to the 10 that they once had. In Barack Obama's desperation for this nuclear deal, they offered immediate sanctions relief. So Iran at this stage had been massively isolated from the international community. Their economy was being crushed because of their missile and nuclear programs. And the Americans said, look, sign up to this deal. We'll give you immediate sanctions relief. The Iranians, overjoyed with this temporary obligation and permanent reward, agreed. All of a sudden, the international community started flooding in investment into Iran, mostly countries that were unfriendly to the United States. So Russia, China, and not coincidentally, just last week, the Chinese government announced a $400 billion investment into Iran over a 25-year period, permanently bringing Iran into an economic dependency relationship with Beijing. At the same time, Israel was freaking out because Iran was getting all these benefits, continuing to sponsor its terrorist activities both in Afghanistan, Hezbollah, Hamas, expanding its influence in Iraq, a Shia majority country, and was really threatening hegemony across the Middle East, who has openly and continuously called for the destruction of Israel and the elimination of the Jewish state. The policy between Israel and the US was quite different. Israel's policy was that Iran cannot have the capability to build a nuclear bomb, and America's policy was that Iran cannot cross the threshold to having one. Quite different, actually. And understandably from Israel's point of view, because they're the ones facing the existential threat. But then there are nuclear strategists moving into the next point. Now that we are on the brink, 60% HEU is basically a bomb. Let's just be real about that. There are nuclear strategists who say that even if Iran has a nuclear device, that's not a big deal. Iran's not going to launch a nuclear attack at Israel, despite the rhetoric, because Iran knows that the only possible consequence of that is A, Israel retaliates with nuclear weapons against Iran, destroying Iran, and America doing that as well, because Iran doesn't have any ability to attack the United States. The US can destroy and obliterate Iran with nuclear weapons without fear of retaliation. So that's what the basic logic that these nuclear strategists put forward. And I just want to say as politely as possible, they're absolute finger painters and need to get off the stage. Okay, these people don't know what they're talking about. Even if we accept that Israel is not going to be faced with like an immediate nuclear attack from Iran for the reasons that have been outlined, if we accept that, well, first of all, can Israel logically accept that? Because Israel is a very small country, right? Any nuclear event that happens on Israeli soil of whatever scale is an existential threat to the Israeli state. This isn't the size of the Soviet Union, the United States, or China. This is a very small country. They can't afford to have it. But also, it completely misunderstands how nuclear dynamics work in the Middle East. At the moment, Israel has an undeclared nuclear arsenal. They have nuclear weapons, but they don't acknowledge that they have it. They leave it ambiguous. But everyone knows that they do. That is a profoundly secure thing, not just for Israel, but for the Middle East. Israel has fought many wars of survival against its regional neighbors that have sought to wipe them out. But if Israel has nuclear weapons and an extremely powerful and capable conventional military, which they certainly do, then it's not worth the other Arab nations building up their conventional forces in an arms race, because even if they were to defeat Israel in a conventional fight, the ultimate consequences, if Israel is desperate, they will use nuclear weapons to defend themselves. The fact that Arab nations know this means that they limit their military expansion, because there's no point overcoming Israel's extremely capable conventional forces if they're not going to get any permanent gains. They're not going to be able to capture Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and wipe Israel off the map, because Israel will retaliate with nuclear weapons. So that knowledge actually creates significant peace in the Middle East. I know it sounds ironic, but that's the way the nuclear dynamics works. If Iran also happens to have nuclear weapons, even if they don't use them, several things also happen. One, Iran feels completely impervious to foreign military intervention. So they will massively ramp up their support for Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, Hamas. They will do all these proxy campaigns against Israel. Israel will never have a moment's peace because Iran will openly threaten its existence with conventional means. Iran also has mortal enemies in the Middle East. The Arab nations, the Sunni countries. So Saudi Arabia isn't just going to sit there with Iran having a nuclear weapon. Saudi money will pour into Pakistan to buy nuclear weapons for themselves. Egypt will ramp up its nuclear program as well. And we will have a cascading nuclear program across the Middle East. A lot of those weapons likely ending up in the hands of very unsavory non-state actors that will willingly use them. We cannot afford for this eventuality to happen, notwithstanding Israel's well-founded fears and concerns. And then, of course, just because sanctions were eased with this Iran deal, just because Iran's now violating all these terms and moving towards a nuclear weapon in violation of the NPT doesn't mean these sanctions are all coming back. China and Russia are announcing new investments basically on a daily basis. Iran is no longer economically crushed under these sanctions regimes. They now have many options with foreign support, to the great detriment of the West and the United States. So what is likely to happen now is Iran is at the point where Israel may feel compelled to launch a military strike against Iran, starting a major war in the Middle East that will drag in the United States, drag in Australia, for very good reasons from Israel's point of view. And then the first major proxy war of the hegemonic challenge between the United States and China begins, because Iran becoming a client state of China, China will absolutely back Iran, as will Russia. We're going to have a massive conflagration in the Middle East, and one in which there's just perpetual misery and nobody wins. And the fact that we are still kind of talking as if Iran is some way off, that 60% HEU, it's not like 90%, it's only 2/3, that is absolutely factually wrong. We are on the brink as I speak right now, and I guarantee you that in the Knesset, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, the discussion is going to be, how the hell did we get to this point and what are we going to do now? And that's a conversation that we should all be having, because otherwise this situation is going to overtake us and everything we do will be reactive. I'm hopeful that this explains the situation well enough. I know it's an extraordinarily complicated issue, but it's so important to get this because the reporting has been so bad, even from people who absolutely know better. If you have found value in this discussion, please hit the like button. Please share this video. Of all the videos that I've done, this is the most pressing. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much.